All right, title is senior engineer, but I'm more acting as a test automation engineer, or test automation architect. So I report underneath the platform and service team, which is very unique in most teams. And by reporting there, I get that blurred, kind of blurring the lines between test automation and DevOps. So things I'm responsible for, I have my own architectural team. We're always seeking the best new tools that will allow us to move faster, building better quality apps. But I also have the champion of continuous integration. And we help teams enable getting CI into their actual pipeline. I always get this question, is like, Gannett who? So Gannett is the parent company. Everybody's pretty much heard of USA Today, but we also have 109 other local news media markets around the nation. You may see some of those markets on this slide today. We're building digital solutions, and so the challenges for us is building, testing, and deploying all these markets in a timely manner using continuous integration and automation. So today I'm going to share some of those handful of design patterns that we use when we're rolling out our automated tests using Selenium. To kind of one of the things at Gannett is we believe that the automation tech stack should also be the same as your application stack. So we have multiple teams at Gannett, and so as of right now, we're kind of phasing out Cucumber when I first started, but we're using Ruby RSpec, we're using Nightwatch, Protractor, Python, so it depends on the team and what's tech stack, so we have a lot of tools at Gannett. So the agenda today, so organization of tests. Kind of don't repeat yourself. Titus hit on this a little bit, but it's really about organizing your code so you're not copying and pasting stuff everywhere. Creating reusable actions or components and page objects so you understand when you're not copy and pasting code everywhere. You're kind of creating this reusable piece to where it's creating reliability, speed, and it helps out for a lot of things. Test script guidelines, it's really a key to really make sure that you have guidelines so everybody's on the same page. Defining a locator strategy, I think that's key. So your automation team understands the strategy, but your developers should understand that strategy also. Weighting guidelines, if you need to use weights, have a guideline around so everybody's on that same page. And lastly, you're going to think about designing for scalability. So design patterns are everywhere, just like these traffic patterns that you see on this slide. The objective is to keep traffic, moving and reduce that congestion, right? And so for this to happen, you need to always continue to evaluate and identify problems in your current design so you can continue to move that traffic and reduce congestion. Well, that same principle also applies when you're doing automated development. You want to make sure that you're moving along and you're reducing, frustration, you're being reliable, speeding up development, and, speeding up execution. So the purpose of that is starting at the stop sign. You're in a rural area, it's small, it works, but it's never been designed to handle high volumes of traffic, right? Well, that community never thought about if millions of people move in the area that they could actually scale. And so I always feel like when you're getting started with test automation, a lot of people are just getting started with it. They're just thinking about getting through the basics and they're not thinking about infrastructure first and not thinking about scale. But as that community starts to grow, I think it's really important is introducing new ideas and evolving from that. And like a stop sign, it improves the traffic flow. But as you add more lights into your community, it only takes one light to be out of sync and it creates congestion. Well, in automation, this is where you need to start thinking about those reusable components, having standards. Everybody needs to be on that same page. You want to make sure you're starting to execute tests in parallel. A roundabout was always designed to make sure all four directions of traffic was moving. But it only takes one person that doesn't understand how to actually operate a roundabout and you have a massive traffic jam. Well, that same principle also applies when you don't have clear standards or guidelines around your automation. People start kind of going rogue, doing their own thing, and that creates their own traffic jams. So I think it's very important to take the time and communicate your standards, your best practices to the team, and take it to a next level. So one of the things my team does is we sit down and we create these self-paced workshops for the team based on what testing framework we roll out or test solutions also. As they're going through these workshops, we bake in our best practices into those workshops. So when they come out of it, they're familiar with the new framework, but they're also understand all of our standards put in place. Flyovers were always designed for scale, high volumes of traffic. I can move at high speeds from A to B. Well, this is a piece of automation where it should be at the beginning when you're starting a test automation project. You want to think about scale using Selenium Grid, Docker Selenium, or using Sauce Labs as your kind of cloud solution to where you can spin up as many servers as possible to handle the volume of testing. But the moral of the story is, design patterns are not necessary, but as a seasoned automation engineer, you understand the importance of actually having them. And so you should make sure you're collaborating and communicating about those standards. So if you're new to test automation, I really recommend people to really start focusing on, how to write good and effective test scripts, and also think about design at the beginning. So the organization of your tests, don't make it complicated. Keep it clear, simple, and set up an organization folder structure for your tests, your reusable pages, components, reporting, so it's clear to where you need to actually do some work. If you're doing something around the house and someone takes your, say your hacksaw and puts it in a drawer and then takes the blade and puts it somewhere else, you're kind of searching around the house trying to figure out where it's at. As long as everybody's clear that it needs to always go back up on the top left of the wall, everybody's going to be in that same guideline. So I try to preach that with my team all the time is, start out with this clear and well planned out structure and make sure everybody understands it so everybody will follow it. It starts with having a good naming convention to where everybody can follow those, same standards. If you're writing a test, that name it needs to be related to the user story. Same as a folder. And before you even write one line of code, you should think about actually creating a skeleton of what your structure is going to look like. It may make sense to you, but it may not make sense to everybody else. So this is the opportunity to kind of bounce that idea off with other people. And clear organization, like I said before, organizing your tools. Make sure everybody understands where everything's organized and doesn't make sense to the team. So to kind of walk through a few examples of one of the frameworks we're using, Nightwatch. A simple approach is it could be a standalone repo. It's not organized with your application code, but then during continuous integration, it's pulled in to run it. It may be easier to create this folder structure. It can be clear, simple, by, everybody understands where all your reusable components will be located based on your page objects, your centralized locators, even down to custom commands to where you're sending status back to Sauce Labs. Creating test groups based on the user stories. So when I need to write a test for a Google search or an inline asset, I know where to actually put that test. So going to more of a complicated scenario, this is where your Selenium tests live within the application. It's not more complicated. It just may take a little bit more work when you're running tests in parallel because you may have to search through each of the actual feature folders to find your test. So take the time to also make sure that you're organizing your reusable components and make sure they're clear, because if you're not clear with that message, it can become very messy. And I think the last thing I would like to talk about here is if you're organizing your code inside the application code, this gives the developers more visibility into your UI testing, but they're also more willing to actually help write those tests. So at Gannett, our test automation engineers are responsible for only writing about 50% of the test. The developers own the other 50%. And so this is where it makes more sense to kind of follow this type of structure. Don't repeat yourself. This principle is, so important to really understand. It's about eliminating the need of duplication code anywhere in the suite of your tests. It seems so obvious, but why would anybody want to be copying and pasting code everywhere? Well, the duplication of code is surprisingly a common problem for beginning developers or even someone new to test automation. So why is that duplication so bad? Well, because it's really a maintenance nightmare, and I have a good example of my first test automation project I ever worked on. We hired 40 non-programmers to start converting manual test to automation using a keyword, test-driven framework called fitness. And they start copying code everywhere. Well, when that test broke, now you got to do a search and try to find everywhere they copied this block of code. And then we had to make hundreds of updates. Well, that nightmare came to reality, and it really slowed us down, and then we had to really start doing a lot more refactoring from that standpoint. So I always tell my team, as you start writing tests and you're finding yourself repeating a block of code multiple times, step back, think about how to organize that to where you can reuse it in a reusable component, like a page object or centralizing your locators. Reusable components, it can be from your page object. I just said page objects, it can be centralizing your locators, it could be custom commands. But the purpose of a reusable code is to encapsulate the web page into a single file. This helps your Selenium test to be more readable, maintainable, and then reusable. But I think it's really important from this standpoint is when you have these reusable components, they're modular, they're independent, and these objects can be reused in any type of test. To walk through some of the Nightwatch examples, I have this custom command. We have to report a status back to sauce if the test passed or failed. On line 2, here we are importing the sauce library. And then we actually need to pass in our sauce username and access key. We need to retrieve the session ID, the job name, and then report that status back to sauce as saying, my test has passed or it has failed. And then we may throw in a console log, so during the console we can actually grab that session ID, and then it helps with some of the reporting. The reason why we want to create this reusable component is because after each test we want to execute this. If you was copying and pasting this to after each test, if something ever changes with this, then you have hundreds of updates. Defining a reusable locator. So we have a new project, it's called Google AMP. It's a single page application. It's an accelerated mobile web experience. And so for us, we're centralizing all of our locators kind of on one page because it's a single page application. So if anything ever changes, we just have to go to this file and make the update. So you can find out between lines 4 and 6 that here we're making those elements and defining them here. Nightwatch also has these kind of global test data. It's allows us to where we can create multiple environment profiles. So at Gannett we have over 110 markets. We try to design our test to where we could take that single test and run it across any market if we need to. And so with Nightwatch we can create these environment profiles to where Arizona Central or Cincinnati Enquirer, they have their own profiles, and then we can set these global property data to where they have these data fields that as long as the critical piece of this is making sure that they're consistent naming, and then you can reuse those inside your test. So when I run that test, trying to access say the very first one on line 62, the AMP access URL, I can go to that AZ Central URL. But then if I flip it over to Cincinnati, I can go to that different article. To kind of put this in action in the sense of a test, starting out here, we're initializing our centralized locators. And then on line 10, this is where we're calling that global test data I was just talking about for a timestamp URL. And then we need to call one of our centralized locators for the author name. And so here we're just reusing, it's reusable in that sense, and that makes it to where it's going to be more efficient, keep your tests more reliable and maintainable. And the last, you're reporting the status back to sauce. So test script guidelines help you speed up development, right? You want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. You want everybody to be consistent. And you want to reduce that maintenance impact. And so having these guidelines is very critical. Writing good test scripts is kind of an art, but I think writing effective test scripts is more engineering. You have to kind of think about it. I highly recommend anybody to use some linting tools. It's a very basic, quality tool which reviews your code. It tells you where things are wrong, and it tells you even how to clean it up. Every programming language has it. And well-defined best practices, standards, linting tools allows everybody to be consistent with each other. So, we have test automation engineers writing tests. We also have developers writing tests. We want to make sure everybody's consistent and on the same page. So it's important to communicate all this stuff to them. Behavior-driven testing. So we started out with Cucumber. I have a love-hate relationship with Cucumber, but the one thing I've always liked about Cucumber is the give and when then. It really straights that collaboration between your developer, your product manager, and testers. And as we started moving away from Cucumber and using Nightwatch to JavaScript, we still use this approach of we outline all of our tests before we write one line of application code, and the team agrees on those tests. So part of that given when then, we still use that syntax in the sense of given this precondition and when these action or steps happen, then this assertion occurs. Everybody understands the user acceptance test that we're trying to test. Clear tagging standards is really important for many reasons. We tag things based on the type of test. Is it a UI component test? Is it an upload tools like visual test? Is it a smoke test? Is it a regression test? We also use tagging based on grouping features together. By having a strict tagging strategy, it allows you for targeted testing. So this allows you, when you kick off a continuous integration pipeline, you could target a certain set of tests rather than running the whole entire suite, so you're saving time there. Find yourself ever repeating, I've talked about this, but I always tell my team is if you find yourself repeating yourself, step back, strategize how to create that reusable object. It's better to kind of centralize that chunk of code. And my last point, be open to change. You may think that everything you're doing right now is perfect, it's rock solid. I walk out this door today and 3 people approach me and they're like, give me an idea. It might be better what I'm doing right now, and I'm going to go back and try to implement that. And that's the one thing I always tell people is be willing to change, because if you're not willing to change, you'll kind of get in a really bad state as everybody else is kind of moving forward and you're kind of being left behind. So weighting guidelines. If you take public transportation, I bet you have experienced delays, inconsistent behavior, or maybe it's just me in the DC area where the metro is just unreliable half the time and I refuse to take it. Well, that same experience, you probably have that same behavior even with Selenium. You're waiting around for an element to happen, to actually display in the DOM, and you're trying to do something. So I always try to tell my team, do not use sleeps in your tests, and you have an implicit wait. You can set up a particular time inside your setup, and this will occur on everything in your code in a sense to where if it expires, it'll throw an exception. And then you have an explicit wait where you're setting a particular time on an action. And so I've always been, what I keep hearing is never mix the two, implicit and explicit waits. Pick one of the two. We're using explicit waits in the sense to where, here's an example with Nightwatch. We're setting, 5,000 milliseconds on this particular action, which is 5 seconds. And the runner will keep performing a check every 500 milliseconds until it finds that locator or throws an exception. So locator strategy. To play chess, each player kind of needs to know how to play the game. And you also need to think about how to improve your game by creating this, the proper strategies, tactics. But when you're playing chess, you also need to learn how to evolve, how to improve your game. Well, that same principle kind of plays around with the locators. Locators are kind of like your lifeline to your Selenium test. The Selenium WebDriver uses these locators to find elements on the page, and the key is to have a real clear locator strategy for your test. But it may be clear to you, but the developers may not know what your strategy is. So I always advise my team and the developers to come together and understand that strategy. Because if everybody understands that strategy, you're going to be very successful with test automation. The most effective way and preferred way is to locate an element on a web page is using a unique ID. But if IDs, the IDs do not exist, a name or the CSS selector is kind of our next choice. The only problem using the name and the CSS selector sometimes is you may have multiple elements with the same name on the page. So you may need to find some other method to access that. And our fourth choice is kind of an attribute. And I always tell my team that we should never use XPath in our automation. I'd rather my team to take the time to work with the developers to come up with a strategy so they understand we need an ID for this particular element on the page. But over time, we've actually built the confidence into our developers to where we're actually making those changes ourselves. A good example is this recently with the Google AMP. Rather than us going to the developer, we're creating our own pull request back into the application project based on what locators we need for our test automation. That saves everybody time by us doing it, and it helps the developer when they see that pull request come in the future, they may code the application into your strategy. Here's an example if you go to USA Today and the top stories. Terrible CSS selector name, but it's, those 10 stories right there are using the same class name. This is not bad, it just depends what your strategy is to test this. For us, we need to make sure that 10 top story articles appear with some type of context in here, and that's good enough for us. But you may need to actually test where each article and dive into each one of those, and you may have to do a really complex unique ID strategy by every time a new article, because we're going to, I come back here tomorrow, those top stories are going to be completely different. But example is you don't always need unique IDs for everything. Just kind of step back, and for us, this CSS selector is totally fine for us to count how many top stories are located on this, particular module. So, designing for scalability. I like this slide because Ford's manufacturing plants, started from day one thinking about scale. The assembly line was with people, but now they're with robots. And they was always thinking about scale in the sense of how fast could I build a car and get it out? Everybody had a job, right? Well, when you start doing test automation, you should be thinking about that scale at the beginning, just like Ford did. Your suite of tests will start very small, and overnight, you'll have hundreds or thousands of tests possibly. And if you didn't think about that scale at the beginning, your execution times increase. I've heard a few people today where it takes 8, 12 hours, and it holds up the release because you have to wait till those tests to complete. And so executing hundreds of tests requires a bit more planning and design. And I always think that it's not good to think about scale at the end. It's better to think about it at the beginning, so you're writing your test. Because if you're doing it at the end, you may develop this whole technical debt and refactoring of your code to allow them to actually scale out. So let me take a few minutes to kind of walk through some of the important points how you could scale some of your test automation. Keep your tests small, modular. This allows faster feedback to the team. Making sure the tests are independent, so there's no dependencies from test to test. What is your SLA agreement? Service level agreement. For us, we're always targeting roughly each individual test should be less than 3 minutes. We could go faster if we wanted to. But the whole completion of our execution needs to be under 3 minutes. So if I need to get 100 tests executed at the same time, I need to know how many servers I need to spin up in parallel to meet my SLA agreement that I have told the developers and product. So you need to think about running tests in parallel, using Selenium Grid. You can use Docker, cloud services like Sauce Labs. If you are new to parallel testing, I recently wrote a blog post about it, so you can check it out. It's called The Benefits of Parallel Testing. It's on Sauce Labs, blog section. I think Titus hit this one a little bit ago around test data. I think it's really important to make sure you're always implementing unique test data. Because if you're not creating unique test data, you're going to have data collisions. So back to that first experience I ever had, we was creating, reading, updating, deleting, and with a load balance environment, and we was getting all these race conditions because a test ran on load balancer 1 and another one ran on 3, but then when it got back to 1, then we had these really weird scenarios where it would pass fail half the time. So I think it's always really key if you're doing a lot of CRUD actions to make sure you have unique data every time. And I think that's critical as you're trying to scale up and running tests in parallel. Last piece, I believe and my team believes that everyone in the team actually owns quality. It's just not a QA effort. Everybody owns it. And to do that, you need to start shifting left. And that's kind of, the testing pyramid. Everything has to be UI tests. You can have all these lower level tests to be part of your pipeline. Every stage of your pipeline should have some level of testing in it. By making this shift to left, you're enabling faster feedback on your testing and integrating code. And by doing that, your team is actually finding problems sooner than later. And to make this shift, it requires daily collaboration as a team. Because like I said, you need to build that quality into every stage. And if you're doing continuous integration, sit down and say, do I have testing at every stage of my pipeline? Because you probably should. Even from your infrastructure code to even actually code reviews, that's part of a stage in that pipeline. But the one key component if you're doing continuous integration or deployment success is it's a community, and it takes that community to actually foster this movement, because you need to be building a repeatable, disposable infrastructure, and you need to make sure you have a champion that is actually owning this. Before I wrap up, we're doing some really awesome stuff at USA Today. We even create our own logos. We have our stickers. We have t-shirts and everything. I'm hiring for some people on my architecture team. We have people in our DevOps. If you're interested, or you know someone's interested, looking for a new position, you can email me or hit me up after the session, and we can talk. Questions? Way back in the back.
You mentioned tagging. Can you talk a little bit more about both the technology and processes your teams adopted to tag your tests and code?
The tagging is pretty much built in most of the frameworks I know. So if you're doing Cucumber, it's automatically, that tagging is already automatically built into it. The same as like Nightwatch, we can tag our tests that way. But we also have an API team on our platform and service team. So as you're pushing code too, we can actually tag that using an API, using Go. So when someone actually makes a change with the code, it's actually tagging that commit of what feature, and so then we can align those two when we do an execution.
Okay, so the code is tagged more than, or the commits are tagged more than the main code.
Yeah, so our actual commits are all being tagged along with our tests being tagged, so then we can align the two.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yep.
Is it okay if I have two questions here?
Fire with the first one, and I'll answer that one, and go second one.
All right. So, how many environments do you have for a release? So, if you have a particular release that you're cutting, do you have dev, int, UAT, and prod? And how do you make the decision to have one or not the other for each product that you have?
Typically, when a creation of pull request is, as of right now, it's been going against dev and pre-prod. As you merge, it goes along with pre-prod. As today, we keep focusing on when we go to production, if finding the best methods to actually start testing that also. And some of the things we're doing currently when we get into prod is using New Relic synthetics. We're working closely with our team to figure out a way to where we could actually connect our existing test into synthetics. If you're not familiar with synthetics, hit me up later. But that's another great way to test production. And then, yeah.
And the other question is pretty simple. I use Jira and Zephyr for reporting and transparency for the team and dashboards and such. Do you have any recommendations there, and do you also do that?
Interesting question. So my 3 years I've been at Gannett, we've been doing everything in Google Docs. But the last 3 months we've been evaluating Zephyr, test rails, and there's another one, I think it's Practitest. So we're looking in that sense because as I was talking, we were trying to work as a team to collaborate of what are acceptance tests. But when we outline those acceptance tests, it could be a unit test, it could be an API test, a UI component or visual. My recommendation, give me a couple more months and we'll figure out the right solution for that, but I would highly recommend everybody has some type of test management tool for manual or even automation, because even us, we're doing a lot of automation, but we still believe there's a lot of exploratory testing that should happen because we don't need automated tests for everything.
So where do you store your test right now?
So for automation, it's all in GitHub, manual test, or in Google Docs. Yeah, it's barbaric.
So you mentioned parallel and Docker. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, so parallel testing, currently today, our parallel testing, we're just using Sauce Labs, but we're starting to explore Docker in the sense of for our mobile solutions, like Android. So last year, my team, we took Android completely from Mac Minis to the cloud, from building and testing, and so we were actually using Docker to spin up virtual devices and actually testing against those devices. But as going forward with Selenium, we're a happy customer of Sauce Labs. We just pretty much throw everything possible there because my first job is we actually built our own Selenium grid and we had 5 developers and we could barely keep up trying to keep the framework up and rolling all the time. So I'd rather just pay someone else to do it.
And one more question, why are you against XPath? Like XPath, why you're
Why do I think I'm an expert? Huh? Oh, why am I against XPath? XPath, I was like, why am I against the XPath? You can change your HTML elements, the divs. You can move things around all the time. If you move one of those, elements around, the XPath becomes very fragile. And the way our teams operate is they're giving us the flexibility to actually go in and create IDs ourselves by creating a pull request back to application code. I feel like that's a better method because now you have some type of ID that's associated with your test. I think Megan mentioned it earlier, having your own testing ID, and I really like that idea because then the developers know that I got automated tests against that, and they would not change that.
actually that's what we do. We have a data test afterwards.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. If you have more questions, you can hit me up afterwards because I feel like I'm getting booted off the stage.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Craig.